I used to believe that fairy tales could come true, that when you meet the right person, everything just falls into place, and the universe conspires to give you that perfect, happily ever after. I still believe in love, but I no longer believe that every story unfolds without its villains. In my case, the villain wore designer clothes, carried a Louis Vuitton purse, and happened to be the woman who gave birth to the love of my life. Where are you watching from today? Comment down below. I met David 5 years ago at a friend's housewarming party. He was standing alone by the bookshelf, running his fingers along the spines of classic novels. When our eyes met, I felt something I'd never experienced before, like recognizing someone I'd known my entire life. We talked for hours that night, discovering a shared love for obscure indie films, spicy Thai food, and long road trips to nowhere in particular. 3 months later, we were inseparable. David was everything I'd ever wanted. Kind, thoughtful, with a wicked sense of humor that could make me laugh even on my worst days. He planned elaborate date nights and remembered tiny details about stories I'd tell him. When he proposed 2 years later, on a cliff overlooking the ocean at sunset, I didn't hesitate for a second before saying yes. "I can't wait for you to meet my parents," he said as we drove to his childhood home for dinner, 3 weeks after our engagement. "My dad is pretty laid back, but my mom can be intense sometimes. She means well, though." That should have been my first warning sign, I suppose. The way his voice changed slightly when he mentioned his mother. The tiny furrow between his brows that appeared and vanished so quickly I almost missed it. Patricia Montgomery was a striking woman in her early 60s, immaculately dressed in tailored clothes that screamed old money. Her home looked like something out of Architectural Digest. Not a pillow out of place, not a speck of dust anywhere. When we arrived, she embraced David warmly, then turned to me with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "So this is the girl who's stolen my son's heart," she said, looking me up and down in a way that made me feel like I was being appraised rather than welcomed. "David has told us so little about you." "Mom, that's not true. I've talked about Jessica constantly," David said with a laugh that sounded slightly forced. "Of course you have, darling," she replied, patting his cheek in a gesture that somehow managed to be both affectionate and dismissive. David's father, Robert, was exactly as described, a quiet, gentle man who gave me a genuine smile and a warm handshake. "Welcome to the family, Jessica," he said, and for a moment, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. That first dinner set the tone for what would become a pattern. Patricia asked questions that felt like traps. About my family. "Oh, your father remarried. How modern. My career as a graphic designer. So it's like drawing for computers? That sounds like a lovely hobby. And our plans for the future. Children right away, I hope." David was always meant to be a father. I tried to be understanding. After all, I was taking her only son, her pride and joy. It made sense that she'd be protective, maybe even a little territorial. David assured me that once she got to know me better, things would improve. 3 months after our engagement, we began planning the wedding. I'd always dreamed of a spring ceremony in the botanical gardens where my grandparents had gotten married 50 years earlier. David loved the idea, and we were thrilled when we managed to secure a date. That's when Patricia really began to show her true colors. "The botanical gardens? In April?" she said during a lunch that was supposed to be a casual wedding planning session. "That's a lovely thought, dear, but so unpredictable. What if it rains? What if it's too hot? The country club has a beautiful ballroom that would be much more appropriate." "We've already put down the deposit, Mom," David explained gently. "And it's really important to Jessica." "Well, it's your day," she said with a tight smile. Though I always imagined my only son would have a proper wedding, not something so rustic. Every suggestion became a battleground. The flowers I chose were too common. The caterer we loved was not up to standard. Even our color scheme wasn't spared her criticism. Navy blue and silver? For a spring wedding? She laughed as if I'd suggested we all wear clown costumes. Pastels would be so much more suitable. Let me show you what I've put together. She pulled out a folder, an actual color-coded folder, filled with magazine clippings, fabric swatches, and printouts of venues I'd never seen before. It was clear she'd been planning this wedding for years, long before I entered the picture. David squeezed my hand under the table. Mom, we appreciate your input, but Jessica and I have a pretty clear vision of what we want. Of course you do, she said, closing the folder with a snap that made me flinch. I just thought you might appreciate some guidance from someone with experience in these matters. Later that night, as we drove home, I finally broached the subject that had been gnawing at me. Your mom really doesn't like me, does she? David sighed, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. She's just struggling with the idea of me getting married. She'll come around, I promise. I don't know, David. The way she looks at me sometimes, it's like she's trying to find all my flaws. That's just her way, he insisted. She's critical of everyone, even me. Nothing I ever did was quite good enough, not until I got into medical school. Then suddenly I was the golden child. He tried to laugh it off, but I could hear the hurt beneath his words. For the first time, I glimpsed what it must have been like growing up with Patricia's exacting standards, her conditional approval. I'll try harder with her, I promised, though I wasn't sure what more I could do. As weeks passed, Patricia's interference became more direct. She happened to schedule appointments with florists and bakers when she knew I'd be working, then called to tell me how she'd taken care of it since I was so busy. David began to notice the strain it was putting on me. I'll talk to her, he promised, after finding me in tears over yet another detail she'd changed without consulting us. He called her that night, and I could hear his voice growing increasingly frustrated as he paced our kitchen. Mom, this is our wedding. No, I understand you want to help, but yes, I know you have connections, but that doesn't mean... Mom, please just listen. When he hung up, he looked exhausted. She says she's just trying to make sure everything is perfect for us. Did she agree to back off? She said she would, he replied, but didn't sound convinced. The real breaking point came during a family dinner at their house, 2 months before the wedding. Everything had been tense but civil until dessert, when Patricia brought out her special chocolate soufflé. This has always been David's favorite, she announced, serving him the largest portion. I used to make it for him after every soccer game in high school. It looks delicious, I said genuinely. She smiled thinly. It's a family recipe. Perhaps one day, when you've proven yourself, I'll teach it to you. The table fell silent. Even Robert looked uncomfortable. Proven myself? I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. Well, dear, marriage is a serious commitment. David comes from a certain background, with certain expectations. I just want to make sure you're good enough for my son, that you can provide the kind of life he deserves. Mom? David's voice was sharp with shock. What? I'm only saying what everyone's thinking, Patricia replied, her tone perfectly reasonable. Marriage isn't just about love. It's about compatibility, about shared values and backgrounds. Jessica is exactly what I want and need, David said firmly. And I'd appreciate it if you would respect that. Patricia merely shrugged, taking a delicate bite of her soufflé. Time will tell, I suppose. On the drive home, David apologized profusely. I had no idea she would say something like that. I'm so sorry, Jess. But despite his reassurances, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The warning signs were all there, flashing like red lights on a dark road. Patricia Montgomery had no intention of accepting me as her son's wife, and she was just getting started in her campaign to prove I wasn't good enough. What I didn't realize then was just how far she would go to sabotage our special day, or how her actions would ultimately lead me to make one of the most difficult decisions of my life. The next 3 months became a masterclass in passive-aggressive warfare. I'd spent my entire career in client services, dealing with demanding people who thought their opinions were gospel. I thought I'd seen it all, until I met Patricia Montgomery. It started with the invitations. We'd selected a beautiful design, elegant but simple, with a watercolor wash in our navy and silver colors. We'd approved the final proof and were just waiting for them to be printed when Patricia called, her voice dripping with false concern. "Jessica, darling, I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of making a few small adjustments to the invitations. Nothing major, just some wording changes to make them more appropriate." My stomach dropped. "What kind of changes, Patricia?" "Well, the font you chose was a bit casual, and the wording wasn't quite right for a formal occasion. Oh, and I updated the color scheme to the lovely pastels I showed you. They'll be delivered next week." She had completely gone behind our backs and changed our wedding invitations. When they arrived, they were cream and pale pink monstrosities, with flowing script that was nearly impossible to read and formal language that made it sound like we were hosting a royal coronation rather than a wedding. "This isn't what we wanted," I told David, trying to keep my voice from shaking with anger. "These aren't even our colors." David called his mother immediately. I could hear her voice through the phone, feigning innocence. "But darling, I was only trying to help. Jessica seemed so overwhelmed with all the planning. Besides, these are much more elegant. Your father and I are contributing quite a bit financially, you know." There it was, the financial card. David's parents had insisted on paying for a significant portion of the wedding, despite our protests that we wanted to handle it ourselves. We'd finally agreed to let them contribute, not realizing it would become Patricia's weapon of choice. "We'll need to reorder," David said after hanging up. "I'm sorry, Jess. I'll pay for the new ones myself." But the invitations were just the beginning. Somehow, Patricia had gotten her hands on our guest list and taken it upon herself to edit it. My college roommate who had blue hair and tattoos, removed. My cousin who was a single mother, gone. My step-siblings from my father's second marriage, erased completely. When confronted, she had the audacity to look confused. "I thought we agreed the venue couldn't accommodate more than 150 people. I simply prioritized family and close friends over casual acquaintances." "These aren't casual acquaintances," I said, struggling to maintain my composure. "These are important people in my life." "Well, perhaps for the rehearsal dinner, then," she replied dismissively. "Though we're keeping that quite intimate." David stepped in. "Mom, we're restoring the original guest list. All of it." The dress fitting was the next disaster. I'd found a gorgeous A-line gown with delicate beading and an open back. It needed some alterations, and Patricia had helpfully suggested her personal seamstress. Against my better judgment, I agreed. When I arrived for the final fitting 1 week before the wedding, I nearly collapsed in shock. The seamstress had completely transformed my dress according to Patricia's instructions. The open back was gone, replaced with heavy lace that came up to my neck. The sleek silhouette had been puffed out with layers of tulle, making it look like a quinceanera dress rather than the elegant gown I'd chosen. "Isn't it beautiful?" Patricia clasped her hands together. "Now it's a proper wedding dress. The one you chose was a bit revealing for a church ceremony, don't you think?" I stood there, staring at my ruined dress in the mirror, tears welling in my eyes. "This isn't my dress anymore." "Don't be dramatic, dear," Patricia said with a wave of her hand. "This is much more becoming." I left in tears, calling the original boutique in a panic. By some miracle, they had a sample of my dress in almost my size. It would need rush alterations, at considerable expense, but at least I would have something close to what I wanted. Meanwhile, Patricia had been busy spreading her own version of events to the extended family. David's aunt called me, concerned. "Patricia mentioned you've been so difficult about the wedding planning," she said hesitantly. "She said you rejected all her suggestions and insisted on doing everything your own way, despite her experience." "That's not what happened," I said, my voice tight. "And is it true you refused to include the family's traditional wedding blessing?" Patricia was very upset about that. This was the first I'd heard of any traditional wedding blessing. When I asked David about it, he looked bewildered. "We don't have a traditional anything. My parents got married at the courthouse because Mom was pregnant with me." The rumors continued to spread. According to Patricia, I was controlling, ungrateful, and trying to drive a wedge between David and his family. Some relatives began to give me the cold shoulder at pre-wedding events, while others offered condescending advice about family harmony and respecting traditions. Everything came to a head at our rehearsal dinner. Patricia had insisted on hosting it at an upscale restaurant of her choosing, overriding our preference for a casual backyard barbecue. She'd arranged the seating so that my family was relegated to a far corner while she held court at the main table. During the toasts, Patricia stood up, glass in hand. When David first told me he was getting married, I admit I was concerned. A mother knows her son, after all, and I wasn't sure Jessica was the right match for him. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. David tensed beside me. "But," she continued with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I've done my best to guide these two young people through the planning process, sharing my wisdom and experience. Though some of my suggestions were met with resistance." She looked directly at me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "I only hope that in time Jessica will come to understand the importance of family and tradition, that she'll learn to put David's needs before her own stubborn preferences." David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "That's enough, Mom." The room went silent. I'd never heard him use that tone with his mother before. "I've watched you undermine Jessica at every turn. You've changed our plans without permission, excluded her loved ones, ruined her dress, and spread lies about her. Not once have you tried to actually get to know the woman I love." Patricia's face went white with shock. "David, I don't know what you're talking about. Everything I've done has been for you." "No," he cut her off. "Everything you've done has been about control. And I'm done letting you control this wedding. Or our lives." He took my hand, pulling me gently to my feet. "Jessica has been patient, respectful, and far more forgiving than you deserve. But this ends now." Patricia's face twisted with anger. "How dare you speak to me this way? After everything I've sacrificed for you?" "We're leaving," David announced to the stunned room. "I apologize to everyone for the scene, but I won't stand by while my future wife is disrespected." As we walked out, I could hear Patricia burst into tears, playing the victim perfectly. But for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. David had finally seen her for what she was, and he had chosen me. What we didn't know then was that Patricia's manipulations were far from over. She had one last card to play, one that would force us to make the most difficult decision of all. The morning after the rehearsal dinner disaster, David and I sat in our apartment, emotionally drained but relieved that everything was finally out in the open. His phone had been buzzing nonstop with texts and calls from his father, aunts, uncles, everyone except Patricia. "Are you okay?" I asked, watching him decline another call. "I should be asking you that," he said, taking my hand. "I'm so sorry it took me this long to see what she was doing. I knew she could be difficult, but I never imagined she'd go this far." "It's not your fault," I told him. "She's your mother. You wanted to believe the best of her." He shook his head. That's no excuse. The way she's treated you is unforgivable. We agreed to focus on the final week before our wedding, trying to salvage what was left of our joy. With just 5 days to go, I called our photographer to confirm the timeline. Oh, she said, sounding confused. I was actually going to call you. I received an email yesterday canceling our contract. My blood ran cold. Canceling? I didn't cancel anything. The email came from your wedding email address, she explained. It said you and David had decided to postpone the wedding due to family issues. Our shared wedding planning email, the one we'd set up specifically to communicate with vendors. The one with a password so simple even Patricia could guess it. With growing dread, I started calling all our vendors. The florist, the DJ, the makeup artist, all had received cancellation emails within the last 24 hours. Some had already refunded our deposits. Others were keeping them as cancellation fees. She's trying to sabotage our entire wedding, I told David, my hands shaking with anger and disbelief. She's contacted every vendor and canceled their services. David's face went pale, then flushed with rage. I'd never seen him so angry. Without a word, he grabbed his keys and headed for the door. Where are you going? I asked, though I already knew. To have a conversation with my mother that's long overdue. I wanted to go with him, but this was something he needed to do alone. While he was gone, I desperately tried to salvage what I could, calling vendors to explain the situation. Some were understanding and agreed to reinstate our contracts. Others had already booked new events for our date. 3 hours later, David returned looking like he'd aged 10 years in an afternoon. She admitted it, he said quietly, sinking onto the couch beside me. She wasn't even sorry. Said she was saving me from making the biggest mistake of my life. But that wasn't the worst of it. While David had been confronting his mother, I'd received a call from our venue coordinator. Ms. Mercer, I'm calling about your wedding cancellation. My heart had dropped. I didn't cancel our wedding. There was an awkward pause. Well, someone did. A woman claiming to be the mother of the groom. She said the wedding was off and demanded a refund of the deposit. And did you give it to her? I asked, barely able to form the words. No, ma'am. Our policy requires signatures from the contracting parties. But she was quite insistent. She said some concerning things about you, actually. What kind of things? The coordinator hesitated. She suggested you were unstable, that you'd threatened self-harm if the wedding proceeded. She seemed genuinely worried. The realization of what Patricia was doing, not just trying to cancel our wedding, but actively attempting to paint me as mentally unstable, left me breathless with shock. Now, as I told David about this final violation, I watched something break inside him. The last thread of loyalty he'd been clinging to snapped. We need to talk about whether she should be at the wedding, I said carefully. There's nothing to talk about, he replied, his voice eerily calm. She's not coming. I don't want her anywhere near us on our wedding day. The next morning, Patricia showed up at our apartment unannounced. Somehow, she looked like the victim. Eyes red-rimmed, expression wounded, dressed in muted colors like she was in mourning. I've come to apologize, she announced as soon as we opened the door. David stood firm, blocking the entrance. We're not interested in your apologies. Please, David, she pleaded. I know I overstepped. I was only trying to help. By canceling our vendors? By telling our venue coordinator that Jessica is mentally unstable? Patricia's expression shifted, the mask of contrition slipping. I was upset after how you treated me at the rehearsal dinner. You humiliated me in front of everyone. You're not welcome at our wedding, David said flatly. For a moment, she looked genuinely shocked. Then her face hardened. This is all you're doing. she hissed at me. You've turned my son against me. No, Mom, David interrupted. You did this yourself. If you ban me from your wedding, you'll regret it, she warned. Your father won't come either. Neither will the rest of the family. That's their choice, David replied. But you are not welcome. End of discussion. After she left, we sat in stunned silence, processing what had just happened. Are you okay with this? I asked David. Banning your mother from our wedding is a big step. He took my hands in his. I've never been more certain of anything. Our wedding day should be filled with people who love and support us, not someone who's actively tried to destroy our happiness. But Patricia made good on her threat. Within hours, the family drama exploded. David's father called, pleading with him to reconsider. Your mother is heartbroken, he said. She made mistakes, but she's still your mother. Dad, she tried to cancel our entire wedding, David explained for what felt like the 100th time. She was emotional. You know how she gets. Can't you find it in your heart to forgive her? Other relatives soon joined the campaign. Aunts called to lecture us about family loyalty. Cousins sent messages about the importance of forgiveness. Even David's grandmother, who I'd always thought was on our side, suggested we were being unnecessarily harsh. Family is forever, she told David. You'll regret cutting your mother out of such an important day. The pressure was relentless. Each day brought new emotional appeals, guilt trips, and thinly veiled threats about family members boycotting the wedding. I watched David struggling under the weight of it all, torn between standing his ground and giving in for the sake of peace. Maybe we should reconsider, he said one night, looking exhausted. Just to stop all this drama. My heart sank. Is that what you really want? He was silent for a long moment. No, he finally admitted. But I hate seeing you deal with all this stress right before our wedding. And I hate the thought of looking out at the ceremony and seeing half the seats empty. The seats won't be empty, I promised him. They'll be filled with people who truly want to be there. The next day, we received a carefully worded email from Patricia, copied to the entire family. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, portraying herself as the heartbroken mother, reaching out one last time to her misguided son. She accepted his decision to ban her from the wedding, but hoped he would come to his senses before making a terrible mistake he would regret forever. Reading between the lines, the message was clear. This was his last chance to fall in line, or he would be cut off, not just financially, but emotionally, from the family he'd known his entire life. David read the email twice, then closed his laptop with a definitive click. I'm done, he said simply. I choose you. I choose us. Whatever happens with my family, we'll face it together. In that moment, I fell in love with him all over again. Despite everything, despite the pressure and the guilt and the fear of losing his family, he chose us. He chose our future. With just 3 days until our wedding, we still had fires to put out and vendors to reinstate. But for the first time since Patricia's interference began, I felt a sense of peace. Whatever our wedding day looked like, whether elegant or cobbled together, with a full house or half-empty rows, it would be authentically ours. And then, unexpectedly, help arrived from the most unlikely source. The unexpected help came in the form of a knock on our door the evening after David's final confrontation with his mother. When I opened it, I found myself face to face with Robert, David's father. He stood there awkwardly, hands in his pockets, looking nothing like the confident businessman I'd met at their house. May I come in? He asked quietly. David appeared behind me, clearly surprised. Dad? What are you doing here? Robert stepped inside, declining our offer of coffee or water. He sat on the edge of our couch, looking uncomfortable but determined. "I owe you both an apology," he began. "I've spent years enabling Patricia's behavior, making excuses for her, telling myself it was easier to go along with her demands than to stand up to her. And in the process, I failed you, David. I failed as a father." David sat perfectly still, stunned by this admission from the man who had always deferred to his wife. "Your mother has issues," Robert continued. "Control issues that go back to long before you were born. I watched her drive away friends, alienate family members, and make everyone around her miserable if they didn't conform to her vision of perfection. And I did nothing." He turned to me. "What she's done to your wedding is inexcusable. And I want you to know that I don't stand with her on this. I'll be at your wedding, with or without her approval." "Thank you," I said, feeling a wave of relief. "That means a lot to us." "There's more," Robert said. "I've spoken with my sister Martha. She's organizing the family members who still want to attend. It won't be everyone, but it won't be empty either." For the first time in weeks, I saw hope return to David's eyes. His father's support meant everything to him. "And," Robert added, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a check, "I want to help you fix what Patricia broke. This should cover the cost of reinstating your vendors, or finding new ones if necessary." The amount on the check made my eyes widen. It was far more than we needed to salvage our wedding plans. "Dad, we can't accept this," David protested. "You can and you will," Robert insisted. "Consider it my wedding gift, and my apology for not standing up sooner." After he left, David and I sat in stunned silence for a moment before springing into action. With renewed energy and Robert's financial support, we spent the next 2 days in a whirlwind of planning, calling vendors and making new arrangements where needed. Then came another surprise. My Aunt Sophia called, asking if she could stop by. She arrived bearing homemade lasagna and a bottle of wine. "So," she said after we'd filled her in on everything, "you've banned the mother-in-law from hell. Good for you, but I'm guessing you're missing some of the traditional mother-of-the-groom support, yes?" I nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of everything Patricia should have been but wasn't. "Well," Sophia continued, her eyes twinkling, "I may not be his mother, but I've been a stand-in mom to you since your mother passed. How about I step in? I promise not to wear white or make a scene." Aunt Sophia had been my rock after my mom died when I was 14. She'd taught me to apply makeup, helped me shop for my prom dress, and given me endless advice about life and love. She was exactly what a mother should be: supportive, kind, and respectful of boundaries. "Would you really?" I asked, feeling tears well up. "Honey, I'd be honored," she said, squeezing my hand. "And I promise not to cancel a single vendor." The day before our wedding, something remarkable happened. Family members began arriving, not just from my side, but from David's too. His father's sister Martha had indeed rallied the troops. Cousins, aunts, uncles, even his grandmother showed up at the hotel, making a point of coming to our suite to express their support. "What Patricia did was wrong," his grandmother told us firmly. "In my day, mothers knew to step back and let the young people make their own choices." By the time our wedding day dawned, clear and perfect, with just enough breeze to rustle the leaves in the botanical garden, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in months. In the bridal suite, surrounded by my bridesmaids and Aunt Sophia, I slipped into my dress, the original design, hastily altered but perfect in every way that mattered. "Patricia doesn't know what she's missing," Sophia said as she helped secure my veil. "But her loss is my gain. I get to be here for this beautiful moment." Outside, the garden was transformed, The navy and silver decorations looked elegant among the spring blossoms. The chairs were far from empty, filled with people who had chosen to stand with us despite the family drama. David's father sat in the front row, alone but smiling proudly. As the music started and I prepared to walk down the aisle, I caught sight of David waiting for me beneath the flower-covered arbor. His face when he saw me, the love, the certainty, the pure joy, made everything we'd been through worthwhile. The ceremony was everything we'd dreamed of. We exchanged our personal vows, promising to always choose each other, to face life's challenges together, to create our own traditions and our own definition of family. When the celebrant pronounced us husband and wife, the cheer that went up from our assembled loved ones was deafening. At the reception, Robert stood to give a toast. He was visibly nervous, clutching his champagne glass a bit too tightly. "I've never been much of a public speaker," he began. "That was always Patricia's domain. But today I want to say how proud I am of my son for recognizing what truly matters in life. Finding someone who loves you completely and brings out the best in you. Jessica, welcome to the family. The real family, not the one bound by obligation, but the one bound by love and respect." There wasn't a dry eye in the house, but the most memorable moment came when Aunt Sophia rose for her own toast. I hadn't expected this. It wasn't part of our plan. "I'm not the mother of the groom," she said with a warm smile. "I'm just a stand-in, but I want to share a piece of wisdom that I think applies perfectly to David and Jessica. Love isn't about control or molding someone into what you think they should be. It's about seeing who they truly are and cherishing that person completely." She raised her glass. "To David and Jessica, may you always see each other clearly, love each other fiercely, and protect your happiness from anyone who would dim its light." The party lasted well into the night. We danced, we laughed, we celebrated with the people who had proven themselves to be our true family. David's father seemed transformed, laughing more freely than I'd ever seen. Later, he confessed that he'd moved out of the house and was considering divorce. "Your courage gave me courage," he told David. "Watching you stand up to her made me realize I could do the same." 1 year later, David and I celebrated our first anniversary with a dinner party at our new home. Around our table sat a collection of people bound not by blood but by choice. My Aunt Sophia, David's father and his new girlfriend, friends who had stood by us, and relatives who had chosen connection over drama. Patricia had made attempts to reconcile throughout the year, but always on her terms, always with subtle digs and passive-aggressive comments. Each time, David calmly reinforced our boundaries, making it clear that a relationship with us would require genuine respect and change on her part. She hadn't managed it yet, but the door remained slightly ajar. Not wide open, not welcoming her back unconditionally, but allowing for the possibility of growth and transformation. In the meantime, we had built our own family, one based on mutual respect and genuine love. "Any regrets?" I asked David that night as we got ready for bed. He pulled me close. "Only that I didn't stand up to her sooner. But no regrets about our wedding day. It was perfect because it was authentically us." I thought about how Patricia's attempt to ruin our wedding had actually given us something precious. The knowledge that we could face anything together, that we were strong enough to set boundaries and protect our happiness. "You know what's funny?" I said. "In trying to tear us apart, she actually made us stronger." "And in trying to control everything," David added, "she lost control of the one thing that really mattered, being part of our lives." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. By trying to force her vision of a perfect wedding, Patricia had missed the truly perfect one we created without her. By attempting to maintain her control over David, she had lost her place in his life. And by trying to prevent me from becoming part of her family, She had inadvertently helped us create a better family of our own, one where people were valued for who they were, not for how well they conformed to someone else's expectations. Sometimes I wonder if she ever truly understands what she lost. But that's her journey, not ours. Our journey continues forward, building a life filled with love, respect, and the kind of family we choose to create, one day at a time.